Good. Sounds good. Let me make sure I accept. Here we are. All right. So good to be with you all once again. I'm just going to share my screen as we get into our third session. Want to remind you all of our ground rules during this time is to listen actively. Please respond because silence can be deadly. Remembering that there's no right answer when we're dialoguing with one another. It's a dialogue. It is not debate. I want us to remember impact versus intent. I want us to remember safety versus comfort. I want everyone to please speak from the I perspective and speak for yourself. Turn on your camera and unmute if you're able to. Respect others. Turn to wonder. If you need a break from a discussion, simply ask for one. It's going to be important for our time that we all take responsibility for our own stuff. Believe the speaker. They know their experience better than you do. And save for the video that we're all being recorded from. I'm going to ask that there's no other recording allowed. All right. So talk to me a bit about how our conversations around racial identity went. What were things that you noticed or learned during that time? And when you're speaking with your friend about their racial identity, what did you learn about their racial identity? Did it cause you to think about your own racial identity and things you learned in that time?
Can I hop in here?
Yes, please.
It's a little bit more, I think, slightly different than racial identity per se, although I think it overlaps a lot. My boyfriend lives in the Bronx. I don't know who really knows the Bronx well. I mean, that's even diverse too.
Yeah.
It's Parkchester, in case anyone's curious.
Oh yeah, I know Parkchester.
Oh yeah, no, it's a nice area. But he grew up, he's a little bit older, so he grew up really the 80s when New York City was just bombed out. And he's kind of reflecting on the subways now, looks just like that, even a little bit worse, coming out of COVID. And homelessness is just rampant. I know, like a lot of other parts of our country. But I was reflecting on kind of where I live, which is very diverse, not my town, but the town I work in, and just how one person's experience growing up in Brooklyn, very kind of rugged areas, very impoverished areas, is going to be very different from growing up as a Black or African-American person in a nice suburban area, even though it's diverse. So even that's going to shape your identity. And it's things that it was interesting to hear. It makes perfect sense, but I'd never had to think about that. So we spent a lot of time talking about that recently and what that means and how that's shaping my own son, who is biracial. So, yeah.
Thank you for that, Leah.
Yeah.
What were some colorblind moments you all noticed during this exercise? Can be your own colorblindness that came up in the stories that were shared.
I can jump in. I think I had some conversations with members of our congregation about race that were also people who are white. And it was just interesting to see, just the ways that people think that race has very little to do with people's experience in society, socioeconomic status, opportunities, that kind of a thing. And so I think I was aware, like I have those spaces for myself too, that I can get caught in that mindset. But just hearing people who have been taught that color blindness is the right way to engage this, and hearing them talk about, like equal opportunity. And I want everyone to have the same experience, and that shouldn't be based on race, and like the ways that conversation perpetuated. And I think with good intention, right? Like, I think the intention was good, but just like what you talked about last time, that there was a period of time that was the right way to do the conversation. And it's like, so getting people out of that mindset is just challenging, I think.
Certainly. Thank you for sharing that, Sarah. Absolutely. What microaggressions did you notice or encounter over the last month?
I like to share. It's back. I don't know if it's microaggression more so than color blindness and race, but two things. One, it's just been the heightened awareness, even around how race and racial identity is playing out, even with the war in Ukraine and the
Mhm.
African
Yeah.
that the Africans that are that can't get out because they're being put in the back of the line because they're from different countries in Africa and the dynamics around that. And then yesterday in running through LA, like all of LA essentially, and just seeing the racial dynamics in each neighborhood and
Mhm.
how just crossing one street as I ran, how the neighborhood just completely changed from like being starting at Dodger Stadium in Chavez Ravine and then going down Hollywood Boulevard through, then Sunset Boulevard and then through North Hollywood where transgender community is, and then going from there to Beverly Hills and running past the Louis Vuitton store. I mean, it was just crazy
Yeah.
to see the racial dynamics and the socioeconomic dynamics and how it's designed by
Mhm.
just running through the neighborhood, running through the city. And that didn't even account for the neighborhoods we didn't go through, like Watts in South Central.
Right. Right. You're thinking about the way that the marathon was coursed, right? Like
Yeah, like my wife and I were talking, like, yeah, we did not run past the projects. I
right.
wonder why.
Wonder why, right? Exactly. So I want to
Hey,
share.
Chris,
Go ahead.
I have one for you, and this literally sort of piggybacked from our last conversation together, and there was a quote that was stated, and the quote was, "I am not different, but people are different than me."
Mhm.
Um, during our last conversation that you spearheaded, and it was quite an interesting quote,
Mhm.
and to the point where in my own leadership and years of facilitating, uh, racial advocacy work and bridging and reconciling all of those kind of things, it was a unique statement. And so I literally was living with that statement since the last time we were together, and also just randomly, just sharing the statement with other key influencers, across the country,
Mhm.
just from a statement standpoint. And many of my colleagues were really shocked by the statement. That the statement really was saying more than perhaps the leader was intending it to say.
Mhm.
The intent had the right heart behind it, but the messaging definitely could be perceived totally different.
Mhm.
And so to the point where many of these leaders were absolutely shocked by the statement. And because, some comments were just for food for thought, was, just hidden privilege,
Mhm.
um, state of denial, almost, not fully embracing the reality of what goes on behind that. The issue of difference, of course, in there as well, that, I'm cool, but there's something wrong with everybody else,
Mhm.
in the world. I'm cool, but
Right.
there's something wrong with you. And so, I mean, the list just went on and on and on. And it was quite fascinating to me. It was very fascinating to me. And again, the intent was not the intent of any form of harm or causing any level of distance, anything along those lines. But it was almost like, the me versus us, you,
Mhm.
we, those kind of separatism, all of those
Right.
things wrapped up into that very short statement, but yet carried a whole lot of weight. That is one of those statements that, you have to pay attention to when you verbalize it,
Mhm.
because it definitely is going to create a rippling effect and an effect that you might not even be expecting or prepared to receive.
Mhm.
And so that was quite fascinating for me based upon, our last conversation. I'm not different, but people are different than me. That's pretty
Yeah.
heavy.
Yeah, that is something. I think to your point, it definitely contains volumes, and it definitely connects back to like one of our ground rules on like the impact versus intent, right? Like when we say things, 9 times out of 10, we don't have any like malice or intent, but we can say
Correct.
in a way that's like, whoa, like this really is bouncing off or resonating off of another person's lived experience in a way that you can't even imagine, right? Like
Exactly. But just in that instant of time, it can cause so much distance and so much harm, but that wasn't even the intent
yeah,
of
far
the
from it.
message. You see? And so, yeah, as soon as I would just say the statement, it was like, whoa, what? You got, just the reaction, that I was getting. And this is from a multitude of people from different races, from different races, different leadership level at the same time, because the statement literally was one of those statements in all of my years of leading this type of work. I had never heard it before. I had never heard that statement before, put that way. We always hear about difference and things of that nature, but not to the point that I am not different. Again, I am not, but everybody else is.
So
that's pretty daggone heavy.
I hear that.
If I may, as I'm listening to this conversation, I think in my mind, I would have inferred that you're saying that you're normal and everybody else is less than you. Right? Because it's true that you're different from me, but to say it in that context, it might have been interpreted as I'm normal, which means, well, which literally means I'm the same as everybody else, but it has this other intention that it means I'm the way it should be, and you guys aren't.
Yeah, you're superior, and everybody else is peons. And
it's possible how that was interpreted as well.
Yeah, and there's something wrong with you. But rise up to my standard, rise up to my superiority, et cetera. And that's why it weighed very heavily, upon my heart as a leader, because like I said, I never heard it put like that before. I never heard that statement before. And it was one that I literally walked away with, whoa, it messed with me for several days because of the impact of that, but also understanding the intent and where it came from, at the same time.
And I think part of what you're speaking about is really important for all of us to understand the historic weight of our words when we're having conversations about race and when we're moving in multicultural spaces. That words that may seem innocuous or may just feel traditional, may feel like, well, this is just how I'm seeing things, this is my perspective, my opinion. They all have historic weight to it, because when what you're saying is coupled with what another participant is saying, it made me think about the legacy of like the white man's burden, like that Rudyard Kipling poem, and this whole understanding of like, superiority and things of that nature, which I'd imagine when these words are being said, like I am normal and everyone else is different from me, that person isn't moving through the world, doesn't have to carry the weight of that history around. And I think that's something for every leader on this call to consider, is like the parishioners you interact with, the communities that you serve. It's imperative that you think about the weight that's being carried, and the weight that weight that's being carried that you've never had to carry, or weight that's being carried that you don't even know exists.
Right.
I think that's a huge part of this, is understanding the ways in which race has forged different realities for people who can share the same space.
Right.
That we can all be in this very conversation together and experience it completely differently because of the legacy and weight of race. But
thanks for that. I didn't want this moment to pass by. I didn't want to co-opt your time either, But I thought, that was such a powerful moment there that needed some additional conversation and revisiting here with everyone that's part of this session.
Certainly, certainly. And I do want to share with you this resource. It's a video, a TED Talk rather, from Tiffany Alvoyd speaking about eliminating microaggressions, the next level of inclusion. I'll go ahead and unshare my screen so I can share the video for you all, because I think it's a really powerful video especially in light of what we're talking about just now. So bear with me as I reshare my screen. There we go. All right, brief advertisement.
Yeah, I'm gonna call it right now. I think I found the single biggest productivity hack of 2021. It's this Google Chrome extension called.
There we go.
The formal definition of a microaggression is listed behind me. Simply put, microaggressions are insults that are rooted in stereotype, and they're directed at someone because of their membership within a marginalized group. Now, because they are rooted in stereotype, they limit a person's ability to be able to see people as individuals. In 1970, Dr. Chester Middlebrook Pierce, a professor at Harvard, coined the term microaggressions to describe insults and dismissive behavior he witnessed Black people enduring. But now the term has been expanded to include offensive comments and behaviors that are directed at anyone in a marginalized group, including but not limited to women, people of color, people with disabilities, and people who are older. So, one of the things about microaggressions is that they're very prevalent in society, and I could do a full day's discussion about that. I actually developed a training that I share with companies to help them address offensive comments in their workplace. We're just gonna go through a couple examples here today. But it's important to note that we all have biases, and anyone can be guilty of making a microaggression or being subjected to one. So why does it matter? Well, for some people, just being themselves can be a revolutionary act because their very being is crushing stereotypes of who and what they should be. Microaggressions wound people. If we were to compare it to getting a paper cut, one paper cut is manageable, but paper cuts all over your body is something quite different. And it's this accumulation of offensive comments in social settings and professional settings that begin to take a toll on a person's spirit. Microaggressions can be an amorphous concept, but it's my hope through the examples I'm going to provide for you that I can provide a more definitive understanding. Microaggressions regarding disability are prevalent. For example, making comments like, "I'm so OCD about my files," or, "Ugh, I can't read today, I'm so dyslexic," when someone does not actually have dyslexia or OCD, can be perceived as a microaggression. These phrases are examples of ableist language, and they trivialize something that is quite serious. For some historical context, I want to discuss what happened when the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed in 1990. The ADA makes it illegal in employment to discriminate against someone because of a mental or physical disability. It also guarantees access to buildings and to public and private transportation. Shortly before the act was passed, several disability activists came to DC and they climbed the 83 steps outside the Capitol building. They met at the base of the stairs and they got out of their wheelchairs, they took off their crutches and any kind of assistive walking devices, and they dragged or crawled themselves up all 83 steps. Now, I like to share this story because it's a good reminder about the historical exclusion that people with disabilities have had to face. And it's also a good reminder that there was a group of people that felt so disenfranchised, so marginalized, and so unseen that they felt the need to do this. Microaggressions regarding race are also very plentiful. Some people might be surprised to know that professing colorblindness can actually be a form of a microaggression. Examples would be, I don't see color. I was raised to treat everyone the same. I work in a diverse environment. I was in the Peace Corps. It's important to note, that is funny. It's important to note that mere proximity to people of color does not make someone woke. Nor does it make them automatically knowledgeable about social injustice issues. These comments actually deny the existence of people of color's experience in the world. And me personally, I've seen these phrases used in a defensive posture when someone's being challenged about something that they may have said that's offensive. What it actually does is shut down conversation, and it allows stereotypes to continue. The last microaggression that I want to talk about is the phrase, that's so ghetto, or that's ghetto. Now, Saturday Night Live has done a sketch about this phrase, and it's tossed around in the workplace and in professional settings, but this phrase can be very offensive to people, and I'm going to provide some historical context as to why. So the word ghetto is an Italian pronunciation. The word is used in 1516 to describe an area of the city where Jewish people are living in the city of Venice. Then in 1899, the word is being used to describe where minority groups are living in the city, and again, it tends to be a low-income area. From a US perspective, the word has been associated with Black and brown people who live in low-income areas. What we're essentially talking about is a place in the city where people are being regulated because of poverty, disenfranchisement, and reasons that point to systemic racism. Now, when I'm talking about systemic racism, what do I mean by that? Well, the GI Bill would be a good example. In 1944, President Roosevelt signed the first version of the GI Bill into law. And that bill essentially made it possible for veterans to go to college and also gave them the ability to get low-interest mortgages, which this sounds like a really good program, and it is. Unfortunately, the way it was administered, it was very discriminatory to Black veterans. The Veterans Administration refused to guarantee loans for developers who planned to sell homes to Black people. When I'm talking about systemic racism, I'm also talking about redlining. Redlining is the practice of drawing a circle around Black and brown neighborhoods and then refusing to give loans to those areas. What I'm also talking about is pushing and shuttling people into a specific area of the city and then setting up situations so that the property remains undervalued. When people use the phrase, that's ghetto or that's so ghetto, it's a way of making fun of someone or something. And for the reasons I just shared, it's not funny. So now that I've given you a couple examples of what a microaggression is, I want to give you a couple tools to avoid making these kind of comments in the workplace. The first tool or tip is pretty simple, is pause. Before you ask someone a personal question in the workplace, pause. Before you compare someone to something or to someone else, pause. Before describing someone's personality, pause. And when you're pausing, think to yourself, what could potentially be the impact on what I'm about to say to someone? Not just my intention, but what could be the possible impact that the way this person could take what I'm saying? Could they be possibly offended? The next thing I want to think about is this comment necessary? Is it promoting a growth mindset? Because remember, my number one priority when I'm at work is to be productive. The next thing that you can do to try to avoid making a microaggression is research. As I discussed in the previous example about that's so ghetto, a lot of American English is slang. So before adding a new word to your vocabulary, just do a quick Google search, just to make sure that what you're saying is not offensive. So before I leave here this afternoon, what I want to leave with you with is, during the course of this conversation, I've been talking about inclusion and respect, which is important, and I hope that you leave this talk with that understanding. But I hope you also took from this talk the concepts of kindness and human decency. Thinking about something before I say it, that's a form of kindness. and treating people the way I want to be treated is one of the highest forms of kindness. Thank you.
Any reactions to that video? Any thoughts, especially in light of like our conversation?
Yeah, I thought about internalized racism
Mhm.
because there are a lot of people in Black and brown communities who say that's ghetto. Or you're ghetto.
100%.
But I know where that comes from. You know,
Right.
It's internalized oppression.
Certainly. Thank you for that. Any other thoughts?
Well, I think it was the perfect video based upon the precursor to it, you know, what we just discussed. I think it's the perfect video as a follow-up piece to that as well. And just, you know, her posture and delivery style on a very sensitive, you know, subject matter, you know, there as well. So I thought it was a perfect, our conversation was the perfect cue up for that particular piece to be shown.
Yeah, for sure. Go ahead, Joanne.
Yeah, I thought it was a great video. And the microaggression part is really difficult as we age, but because we may not even realize it. I'm not saying it's, you know, it's right or wrong, but
Right.
depending on where we are, we have to think before we speak and in any situation. So if you're in a very friendly situation with people, you would hope that if you said something wrong, which my kids tell me when I say something like that, they'll remind me about it. Or I want someone to tell me, you know, that's really just not the cool thing to say right now.
Right. And I'll add to that because we're going to go into the definition of power soon, that is ideal, but we also have to understand that because of power dynamics, not everyone's going to feel comfortable saying, hey, Joanne, that wasn't the right thing to say.
Exactly.
Right. And that we, especially in positions of authority and just like the social power that people have, you may have offended somebody and never know.
That's my point. I mean, you didn't mean to do that. So I would hope it works both ways, that someone else realizes what that dumb old lady really didn't know what she did.
I hear what you're saying. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. I appreciated her call to pause and to think about what the potential impact might be. But I was thinking about, like, if you have not listened to voices from that community, like, you may not even be able to know what the impact might be, right? So, like, I think that the learning and the listening is going to help you empathize and help you know how things could be received. But if you haven't done any of that, it's hard even to, like, the pausing may not help you know. Right? Like, you have to, that may not necessarily guarantee you empathy.
Yep.
Totally. Well said. Well said. All right, go ahead, Gary.
Yes, it occurs to me that a lot of these sort of phrases occur in social situations. Might not even be you who's using them. It might be, or you might have learned them from, you know, peer pressure or however you want to put it. And it's going to be difficult for me to think about how to handle a situation like that. It's not, I'm going to call out my coworkers, my friends, or am I just going to let it slide and say to myself, well, I wouldn't say that.
Right. And then thinking about this level of it as well, Gary, like, let's say, connecting your situation to what Joanne was sharing. Let's say you're in a position of authority and it's a colleague who also shares the same level of authority, but they've said something that's offensive to someone who does not share that authority. Are you going to extend your allyship to that person who has less power than you to interrupt the microaggression, right? That's what it's really going to take. I think that's really
what it's going to take, but it's not going to be easy.
Oh no, none of this is easy. If this were easy, this would be a 30-minute one time thing, right? Like,
True,
you know,
absolutely.
But it's really a sense of understanding that part of this journey is a cost. It's a significant cost, like being willing and courageous enough to interrupt things that, you know, someone may say to you, what's the big deal? Why are you making this a thing? And then the other person may be thanking you for really saving them from, you know, a constant microaggression or worse.
I have a question. I don't know if it's the same or off. It's not off topic, but I don't know if it's the same. would a microaggression, would this be a microaggression? So I went back to my home church one time, and the deacons that were there, older deacons, and I went back and one of them said, "Preacher, you've been eating good." Now,
Right.
now I've been working out, trying to,
Do your thing.
and I just felt like, dang,
Yeah.
it made me want to go to the gym. Like, is it even working? So I don't know if that would be considered a microaggression or not. But yeah.
I think my colleagues who do this work with regard to sizeism specifically, right, would absolutely say that that's a common microaggression. Because the way you say it, I think about, I come from Jamaican culture and family, so it's not uncommon to see like someone see like, oh, you're getting big, right? And they're not necessarily trying to like tear you to shreds. But to your point, if you're like, wow, I've been going vegan and drinking my smoothies, it's like, well, I guess I'm just gonna eat air now. You know what I mean? There's a part of you that feels that way as well, right?
Okay.
I think and we'll see how that connects with the social matrix that we'll look at in a few minutes as well. I think it connects really well to that.
One thing that was really sticking out to me, and I think this goes to your point too, Pete, is so much of these microaggression things that she was talking about, talked about, these are things that could be perceived as microaggressions. So much of microaggression is left up to perception. Yeah, there are some things that we can say that like, yeah, that's definitely a microaggression. I can feel that. But really it comes on the individual basis of, Pete, you experienced it as a microaggression, whether he would name it as that or not, because of the effect that it had onto you. So really, as we in, majority cultures and majority of, white folks here who are, maybe don't experience microaggression to the same degree, we want to be more perceptive on how our words can be perceived by others. I think of Daniel Hill's book on being wide awake, and this whole idea of like just having our eyes opened a little bit more to seeing how our words can be perceived by others. And I think that's really where her TED Talk comes in, is saying like, these are some ways that it could be perceived, whether the intent is there or not. Just being cautious.
And it's so much a white privilege issue. I mean, I think white privilege is just all over this. So many people that have no clue about what that really means.
Yeah. And if you think about the way in which your words land, and it's like, is it worth making this joke right now? Is it worth it to, say that the first thing that came to your mind? Or is it, to Tiffany Alvoyd's point, so much more precious for us to pause and consider the weight of our words, that what you're saying isn't just a flippant thing, whether you want it to or not, whether you think it's fair or unfair, those words are carrying 400 plus years of weight. And so is it worth it to say what you're saying,
And even with the gender dynamics, I have a real-time example in the whole pause piece. When we first got on Zoom and when Leia got on, I was going to comment about her blouse, but then I paused and said, wait a minute, should I comment on her blouse as a male to a female? I just wanted to pause and reflect before I said, oh, that's a nice blouse. Like, even though it would not have been like in malicious or anything, but the way she could have, received it could have been, some way. So by just pausing and not saying anything, now I put it out there, but before then I have, it didn't have to have whatever impact it would have. And we can live without it, right?
Yeah, for sure. Right. So let me share with you all some definitions. So first, looking at the definition for power. And for our intents and purposes, power is the ability to influence or outright control the behavior of people. It's also important to note that the exercise of power is accepted as endemic to humans as social beings, right? Now, it's not exclusively to humans. If you look within the animal kingdoms, you will certainly see power being exercised. But when it comes to human beings, localizing it to the human experience, power is part of every single human interaction. Right? There are no human interactions that don't have power in the mix. And next, the definition as coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw of intersectionality. And this is the overlapping or intersecting of social identities and related systems of oppression, domination, or discrimination. So what I want to show you, and we won't go through the exercise because of the, for the sake of time, but I will certainly send a copy of the social matrix to you all, is looking at the social matrix and understanding the ways in which we carry a multitude of identities. So this social matrix includes identities such as physical health, years of education, parents' occupation, family migration history, citizenship, your chosen religion, your relationship to the legal system, connected back to the example that Pete offered about physical appearance and who you were raised by. And so as you do this, what I want you to do after the session, like between this session and our next session, is looking at this social matrix. And I encourage you to print it out and use crayons or highlighters and really look at this core of the social matrix as the core of who you are, and thinking about which identities represent me to the world. Like, what are my like true understandings of myself? Like, what's really important to me? So I may be someone who my years of education is really important, right? Like I wear that proudly everywhere I go. So I might, because of the years of education, highlight from that center point all the way out. But I may not really think about my parents' years of education that much. This may not be that important to me, so I won't highlight that far out, right? So I want you to consider this exercise in two ways. One, the ways in which these identities are really important to you, and the ways in which those identities are really important to the world. So for me, I may never think about my age, right? Like my age is not something that's important to me, but it seems to people around me, whether it's coworkers, people at my church, people, family members, my age is really important to them. So a second way to do this is to say, okay, if it's really important for them, to highlight from the outside age all the way toward your center, right? So you're not starting at the core of who you are, you're starting from the edge of the circle and highlighting to the core of who you are. So if someone thinks that age is really important to you, like you're only X age or you've lived this many years, I would want you to highlight from the edge of the circle all the way to the core of it. But if someone or people generally don't care about the languages you speak, it never comes up, then you may barely highlight if you highlight at all. But the two ways I want you to do this exercise are from the core out and from the outside to the core. And this will give you a really great understanding that will help you answer those 4 questions that you see in the bottom right corner of this task, which are: number 1, which identity holds the most privilege for you? 2, which identity is most marginalized for you? 3, in which identity do you feel the most pride? And lastly, which identity do you think about the least? And I've often said to participants that I believe that the identities where that we think about the least are typically where our privileges are, right? When you barely have to think about it, that's where you may have the most privilege, right? So if you're someone who's like, I never think about my relationship to the legal system, like it's not even a thought, I never think about it, that may be where your privilege lies. And it could also be for number 3, in which identity do you feel the most pride? It would depend on your the amount of privileges through which you move through the world, because you may be someone who takes the point through which you're most marginalized and made that your point of pride, right? So you may say, you know what, I am this ethnicity, or my family recently migrated to the United States, and this becomes a point of pride for me in spite of all the difficulties and the social stigma that surrounds it, right? So understanding that number 3 could be a point of privilege, but often is a point where you can most see where people's marginalization is. And number 4 often is where you find the most privilege for a person, right? So this is a larger example of that same social matrix, so you can see it. And as I mentioned earlier, I will certainly be attaching this to the other materials you will use for the month in between, right? So now I want us to think about the Book of Esther. So what I want to do is for our time, we have 15 minutes or so, I'd like to get us into breakout groups for like 5 minutes or so, and then just discussing a few questions that I'll enter into the chat so you all have them. First, I want you to think about what word, phrase, or image comes to mind when you think of the Book of Esther. Like, what were the things in the Book of Esther that really stood out to you, that made you, that stand out to you in terms of a word, a phrase, or an image, okay? And then I want you to discuss that for about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back together in our main groups. Let me create the breakout groups really quickly, make them as small as possible. There we go. All right, the rooms are now open, and I will see you all in 5 minutes.
I'm gonna stay in this room.
Hey guys, I'm transpiring, so I need to stay put for right now.
And no worries.
Okay, thanks.
right, I think everyone's back. So I want you to hold those conversations in mind as I go through this a few notes, and I want to thank everyone in advance for also using the ebook I recently released a time like this, which is an anti-racist approach for the Book of Esther. And if you need information on how to purchase it, I'll be certain to include that in the email as well. But fascinating parallel in the Book of Esther is that we see Vashti removed for not showing up, while Esther risks removal by showing up, right? So the reader, the audience knows that what Esther is getting ready to do and is being asked to do by Mordecai is not something simple. It can cost her very life, right? And so we sort of get an understanding of what the stakes are. And another interesting dynamic in this text is that we see Mordecai as a protector throughout the text, right? So we know he's not asking for Esther to do something unreasonable or just reckless, right? We see him report the anger of Bigthan and Teresh, who were two of the king's eunuchs who were angry enough to almost, desire assassination for the king. But he also encourages Esther to be brave, and their work ultimately is a key component of Haman's genocidal plans being defeated. When we see Haman, it's important to think about Haman through these modern lenses of xenophobia and culpability, right? Where he's speaking to the king and talks about a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdoms, and how their laws are different from every other people and they don't keep your laws. And there's really no benefit for the king to keep them around, right? So this is how he tries to state the claim and really dehumanize the people of Israel. And I think an important aspect, and I'll share information even more so later, is just understanding the weight and the stakes of what Haman's desire was and how serious a situation, a predicament this is for the people of Israel. When I read Esther 3, and then when you read Esther 3, I want you to imagine or rather see the parallels between the stakes in that situation with Black Wall Street and all of the other examples of terror that have happened to Black people within the United States, right? Because we're understanding that Haman's plan was simply to annihilate all Jewish people, right? Regardless of their age or gender, in one day, right? On this 13th day of the 12th month, which is Adar, right? And not only to destroy their bodies, but also to commit economic violence against them as well by plundering their goods. But we see in Esther 4 that there's an importance of outrage whenever we see instances of injustice, right? That wickedness should make us upset, that righteous indignation is okay, right? That I'm not asking anyone to take part in this sort of like manufacturing of outrage that seems to be in style today, but I'm speaking about a divinely inspired righteous indignation, that when we see wickedness and it makes us upset, that we join in God's anger towards wickedness. That anger, that wickedness is very displeasing and infuriating to God, and it should strike us in the same manner. Esther 4, 9 through 11 is the biblical lens through which I understand anti-racism, right? This understanding that it is not enough to not be a racist. And the question that I continue to be inspired by and it's further formed by my reading of Esther 4, verses 9 through 11 is, what are you doing to dismantle white supremacy? It's not enough to just be upset and to just speak about that privately, but what are you doing? What's actually happening from your part to dismantle white supremacy? Bishop Desmond Tutu had a famous quote where he said, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. And a little bit about intersectionality, I want us to think about how Mordecai's speech in the book of Esther speaks to contemporary audiences of the well-educated and well-resourced who don't identify with the marginalized, including people of color who don't interact with poor people or less educated members of their own ethnic group, right? So Mordecai says to Esther, think not that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews, for if you keep silence At such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? It's important for us to know that justice is participatory. Esther tells the people to fast, and we can see a parallel between this mandate and the historic tradition of corporate prayer and the multifaceted nature of the movement. So in modern times, civil rights era, for example, Dr. King relied on Sidney Poitier, Mahalia Jackson, and Harry Belafonte, who were entertainers who used their talents and agency in order to strengthen the movement. Also important to see the cost of discipleship, to borrow Dietrich Bonhoeffer's words, where we see Esther saying, "If I perish, I perish," resonates with words that would be said in the 1930s and 40s by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. Esther teaches me not to be upset with insiders, not to be upset by people who have a proximity to power and agency, because God uses their access just as God can use the outside agitator, right? It's because of Queen Esther's proximity to the king that she's able to make her request be made known. And that proximity becomes an avenue through which God can deliver God's people, right? We also see that Haman's intolerance of Mordecai is very similar to the ways in which historically Black people in the United States have been viewed as uppity or not knowing their place, right? That Haman, it says in chapter 4 and chapter 5, essentially that Haman went out that day joyfully and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and the fact that Mordecai neither rose nor trembled before Haman, that's what filled him with wrath against Mordecai, right? So thinking about the ways in which Black people were expected to step off the sidewalk or not make eye contact or things of that nature. I want to position Mordecai as an example of consistent integrity, because had he not shown integrity regarding the eunuchs earlier in the story, Haman may have succeeded, right? That it's because of his ability to interrupt that assassination attempt that allowed his integrity to be an example rather than Haman's words of lies and deception to become the main story. An example of your enemies becoming your footstool, we see in the book of Esther, where the scripture says, "Make haste, take the robes and the horses you have said, and do so to Mordecai, the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." Haman's doubly shamed because the author uses a reversal of fate, because the celebration that's prepared for Haman is actually received by Mordecai. And the gallows that Haman prepared for Mordecai, Haman is executed upon. It's important to understand the impact of what Esther and Mordecai did in this text. What Haman's desire of genocide, had they been carried out, would have impacted 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. And so it's able to see the way in which courage certified dignity for the Jewish people. Right? It says in Esther 8, "By these the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to slay, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them with their children and women, and to plunder their goods upon one day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar." So the exact same day that Haman had planned for their genocide, the people of Israel were able to use to defend themselves. And the proper response in this time is to create, rather to respond in gratitude. We know that the holiday that was just celebrated last week, called Purim, was created during this time, right? It's this understanding that the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for seeming choice portions to one another and gifts to the poor. Part of the tradition of Purim that's celebrated by our Jewish brothers and sisters is understanding that God laughs at evil. And Purim is an opportunity to join God in laughing at evil, at mocking those who plan evil. Essentially, it's important for us to remember that justice is an intergenerational discourse, that we can't forget the cloud of witnesses as described in Hebrews 11, that trod the stony road of justice and bled for us all to be here. In Esther 9, it talks about the Jews ordained and took it upon themselves and their descendants and all who joined them, that without fail they would keep these 2 days according to what was written and at the time appointed every year, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation in every family, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. So I want you to think about our actions for this week. It's to start intentionally thinking systematically and structurally. I want you to think about your workplace, your community, and how you fit in there. What power do you have in your work? What power does your workplace have in greater society? Your workplace, if you, let's say you work by yourself, I want you to think about your church community. I want you to think about your community at large, right? What power do you have in your greater society? And also, I want you to create an image, poem, it can be a blog, it can be a podcast about what hospitality looks like. I'm going to send you all an article about Robert Moses. I want you to read Intersectionality Explained as well. And then I'll be sure to send you all the social matrix so you can use that and answer those questions that are attached to it. And I'll send you some questions that we would have used for our discussion, but you can answer it independently and we'll be able to share out for our time in April. So any questions or thoughts? I know we kind of did like the speed through, breeze through, but I want to recommend that you rewatch this video if there's a part that's like, oh, he went through that so quick. Thankfully it's recorded so we can rewatch it again. But any thoughts or questions before we close? All right, seeing none. Just want to thank you all so much for your time, attention, and the lively discussion. If anything does come up between now and the next month, please don't hesitate to send a note and we can set up time to talk or email and correspond with one another. Okay.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.